The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, even though cases were lined up back to back. Most people sitting on the benches looked half bored, scrolling through their phones or whispering softly to each other. It was supposed to be just another routine day, nothing special, nothing dramatic, and the case that was about to begin seemed even smaller than the rest. At least that's what everyone thought. The judge, an older man known for finishing cases quickly, glanced at the file in front of him. It was thin, barely holding a few sheets of paper. He sighed in a way that showed he already believed this wouldn't take long. He had seen hundreds of similar situations, and most of them ended the same way. To him, this was just another small matter that didn't need much attention. The young man at the center of the case sat quietly beside his lawyer. He didn't look angry or defensive. If anything, he looked tired, as if he had been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time. His hands were folded neatly on his lap, and he kept his eyes lowered, not in guilt, but in deep thought. People who looked at him for a moment couldn't decide what kind of person he was. He didn't look like someone who caused trouble. But appearances don't always convince a courtroom. Across the room, a few neighbors who had come as witnesses whispered among themselves. They seemed confident, almost too confident, as if the outcome of the case was already in their favor. One of them shook his head slowly, as though he had already made up his mind about the young man. Another leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for the judge to start so they could get it over with. The young man's lawyer didn't seem tense either. He had spoken to his client earlier and knew that the story was far from as simple as the papers made it appear. But he also knew that sometimes, no matter how complicated the truth was, people judged based on what they thought they saw. And today, it seemed like everyone in the room had already made assumptions without hearing a single word from the one person who truly knew what happened. The judge called the courtroom to order. Chairs shuffled, phones went silent, and everyone straightened up slightly. The young man finally lifted his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to look at the judge. Something in his gaze was different, not fear, not anger, but a strange calmness, like someone who had accepted whatever might come next. The prosecutor stood first. He carried a stack of papers under his arm, walking confidently toward the front as if he were handling the most straightforward case of his career. He didn't look at the young man at all. Instead, he faced the judge and began reading the accusations in a formal tone. His voice echoed through the room, every word making the situation sound worse than it really was. People in the courtroom nodded slightly as the prosecutor spoke. To them, it sounded believable. After all, if several neighbors claimed the young man caused trouble, why question it? Most of them didn't know him personally. They had only heard stories, and stories have a way of changing after passing through several mouths. The young man listened without moving. Every accusation hit him, but he sat still, taking in each word. It wasn't because he agreed with them, far from it. He simply chose not to interrupt. He knew his moment to speak would come, and when it did, he wanted to make sure he said everything clearly. When the prosecutor finished, the judge nodded, looking unimpressed. The judge had already understood the case in his own mind, or at least he thought he had. A simple issue, a simple verdict, nothing more. How do you plead? The judge asked, his voice plain. The young man didn't answer right away. He breathed slowly, gathering his thoughts. His lawyer placed a hand near his arm, encouraging him silently. After a moment, he replied in a steady voice, not guilty. Some people in the courtroom raised their eyebrows. Not guilty. With so many speaking against him. A few whispers floated across the room. but they faded quickly when the judge cleared his throat. The judge then asked the prosecutor to call the first witness. A middle-aged man walked up, adjusting his jacket as he took the stand. He glanced at the young man briefly before looking away. His voice was firm as he described what he believed happened. According to him, the young man had caused trouble several times and had been warned before. His words made the young man sound like someone who never listened, someone who didn't care about others in the neighborhood. The court clerk typed every word as the witness continued speaking confidently, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced his version of the story multiple times. He avoided mentioning anything that might make the young man look innocent. Instead, he focused only on the things that made the situation seem clear-cut. The young man watched him from his seat, not with anger, but with a sadness that was hard to miss if someone looked closely. He knew the witness wasn't telling the full story, but again, he didn't react. He trusted that the right moment would come. Another witness came up, this time a woman from the same neighborhood. She spoke softly but firmly, repeating what the first witness had said. She didn't add anything new, yet her voice added to the already heavy atmosphere. People in the courtroom started believing it even more. After all, two people saying the same thing had to mean something, right? The young man's lawyer asked a few questions, trying to dig deeper, but the witnesses kept their answers short. They didn't want to open the door to anything that might weaken their claims. They wanted the young man to look guilty because that was easier than accepting the complicated truth. By the time the second witness stepped down, the judge looked ready to close the case. It had taken less than half an hour, and everything sounded too simple, too straightforward. The judge leaned back, glancing again at the thin file, as if wondering why this case had even been brought to court. The young man noticed the judge's expression. He could see that the decision was nearly made, even though he hadn't said a single word about what really happened. He took a quiet breath and looked down again, almost as if preparing himself for the worst. Then the judge turned his attention toward him. "Do you have anything to say before we move forward?" The judge asked casually, not expecting much. The question hung in the air for a moment. The room fell silent again, waiting. Some people rolled their eyes, thinking the young man would either stay silent or speak only a few words. No one believed he had anything meaningful to add. The witnesses sat confidently, convinced the case was already won. The young man lifted his head slowly. It was the first time that morning he really looked around the courtroom. His eyes were calm, but carried a level of honesty that made a few people shift uncomfortably. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't look confused or scared. Instead, he looked like someone who had finally reached the moment he had been waiting for. The judge tapped his pen impatiently, assuming the young man was wasting time. "If you have something to say, say it," he said, and finally, the young man nodded. He was ready. What no one knew, not the judge, not the witnesses, not even most people in his own neighborhood, was that the truth he was about to reveal would turn the entire case upside down. What everyone expected to be a quick decision was about to shift into something completely unexpected. The courtroom, which began the day bored and uninterested, had no idea that everything was about to change. The courtroom felt heavier as part 2 of the case began, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. It was almost as if the air carried a sense of pressure that no one fully understood. The young man sat quietly in his seat, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Even though he looked calm, there was something different in his eyes, something that made a few people glance at him twice. But most people ignored it. They were too focused on what they believed the truth already was. After the judge asked if he had anything to say, the young man simply nodded but didn't speak just yet. The judge took that as a sign that he had nothing important to add, so he continued with the next part of the hearing. He called for the prosecutor to continue presenting the case. The prosecutor stepped forward again, carrying himself with the same confidence he had earlier. His expression said he was certain of the outcome. He didn't bother to question whether the story he was presenting was complete or fair. He believed the witnesses, and he believed that the young man sitting quietly was nothing more than a troublemaker trying to escape responsibility. What the prosecutor didn't know, or maybe didn't care to know, was that people's stories are not always as simple as they sound when spoken in a courtroom. But for now, he read from his notes, summarizing the situation in a way that made it appear as if everything was crystal clear as he spoke. The first witness from earlier shifted in his seat. He avoided looking at the young man completely. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, as if trying to maintain confidence. But if anyone had been watching closely, they would have noticed the faint tension in his eyes. The judge nodded along, his face expressionless. But internally, he had already built a picture of who was right and who was wrong. He believed the witnesses because they had spoken confidently. He believed the prosecutor because his explanation sounded organized. And he believed the papers in front of him because they were written clearly. But he hadn't heard the most important voice yet. Once the prosecutor finished summarizing, the judge asked if there were any more witnesses. The prosecutor nodded and announced a third person would speak. A man from the same neighborhood walked up to the stand. He was older than the first two witnesses, with a calm expression but eyes that held something uncertain. When he spoke, his tone was softer, not as sharp as the others. He described what he had seen or what he thought he had seen. But his version felt slightly different. He didn't sound fully convinced of his own words. Several times, he paused, searching for the right way to explain what happened. It was clear that he wasn't lying, but he didn't seem confident either. The judge waited patiently, but the people in the benches seemed restless. Some leaned back, thinking, "Why is he dragging it?" Others whispered, wondering why he seemed unsure when the case appeared straightforward. The young man watched the third witness closely. He wasn't angry. He wasn't judging. Instead, he watched with a kind of silent understanding that made it seem like he knew the man was struggling with the truth. Maybe the witness knew more. Maybe he knew something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. After a few minutes, the third witness stepped down. He looked uncomfortable as he walked back to his seat. The judge thanked him, although he didn't seem to think his testimony added anything significant. The prosecutor took a breath, preparing to make his final comments before the judge moved toward a quick decision. He stepped forward again and spoke in a firm voice, saying that all the witnesses had confirmed the young man's involvement. He made it sound like a perfect puzzle where every piece fit exactly where it was supposed to. But outside of the prosecutor's confidence, there was a strange feeling in the room, a feeling of something missing. A woman sitting in the back row whispered to another person beside her. "It feels too easy," she said softly, "like something isn't adding up." Her friend shrugged, not wanting to disagree openly. Most people prefer to follow the majority even when their instincts hint otherwise. The judge finally looked at the young man again. He tapped his fingers lightly on the edge of the bench, a habit he had whenever he felt like moving things along quickly. To him, the case was almost done. All that was left was to give the young man a chance to say something before he finalized the judgment. Pressure in the room rose the moment the judge spoke. "You may speak now," he said. All eyes shifted toward the young man. Some looked annoyed, expecting a short speech filled with excuses. Others looked curious, wondering if he would even bother to defend himself. The witnesses avoided eye contact with him, pretending to look elsewhere. The young man inhaled slowly but didn't stand up yet. Instead, he looked around the room, noticing how everyone was waiting, but waiting without really caring. He could feel that people had already closed their minds. They believed the story they heard because it was easy to believe. Still, he didn't seem angry. He seemed patient, as if he had expected this from the beginning. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered, "You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but if you do, make sure you say everything." The young man nodded again, slowly. Then, before he could rise to speak, the prosecutor quickly added, "Your Honor, before the defendant speaks, I want to remind the court that the witnesses were clear and consistent." His tone was sharp, almost as if he was trying to shut the young man down before he even opened his mouth. He knew that if the young man said something unexpected, the entire situation might shift, and he did not want the case to get complicated. The judge frowned slightly at the interruption but didn't scold the prosecutor. Instead, he turned his attention back to the young man. "You may continue," the judge said again. The young man slowly stood up. His chair made a faint sound on the floor, echoing louder than expected in the quiet room. He placed one hand on the table for support, not out of fear, but to steady his thoughts. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that immediately made a few people sit up straighter. He began speaking not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, not even to the witnesses. He spoke to the entire room, addressing everyone at once. His tone was calm and sincere, as if he wasn't trying to convince anyone but simply telling the truth because it needed to be heard. He started by explaining that things were not as simple as they had been described. He explained his side of what happened, but he didn't rush. He took his time, choosing each word carefully. His honesty wasn't dramatic, but it felt real enough to make a few people in the room slowly lift their heads as he talked. The witnesses shifted in their seats. The first witness seemed uncomfortable, tapping his foot nervously. The second looked at her hands, avoiding eye contact. The third witness, the one who sounded unsure earlier, looked directly at the young man with an expression that almost seemed relieved, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally say what he couldn't. People in the back row started whispering again, this time with confusion. They didn't expect the young man to speak with such clarity. They didn't expect him to explain things in a way that made sense, in a way that filled in the gaps that had been bothering them subconsciously. The young man didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult the witnesses. He simply told the truth, gently but firmly. He mentioned details that no one else had brought up, that changed how the story fit together as he spoke. The prosecutor's confidence cracked slightly. He straightened his papers, cleared his throat, and glanced at the judge, hoping the judge would stop the young man. But the judge didn't. For the first time that morning, the judge was actually listening, truly listening. The tension in the room kept building, but it wasn't the kind that created chaos. It was the kind that forced everyone to rethink everything they believed just an hour earlier. When the young man paused to take a breath, the judge lifted a hand slightly, signaling for him to continue. It was subtle, but it told the room that the judge was no longer treating the case as a quick decision. The prosecutor tried not to show it, but he was worried. The witnesses looked nervous, and the people sitting in the benches leaned forward, waiting for the next part of the young man's testimony. He wasn't finished yet, and no one knew that what he would say next, what he was gathering the courage to reveal, would shake the courtroom far more than anyone expected. The courtroom grew incredibly still as the young man continued standing, preparing to share the part of the story no one had bothered to ask him about. It was strange how the room, which had felt half asleep earlier, was now completely focused on him. Even the people who had walked in with a fixed opinion were now sitting up straight, waiting to hear what he would say next. They didn't know why they were suddenly so alert, but something about his calm voice had pulled them in without force. He lifted his eyes for a moment, noticing how everyone was watching him. Some faces were tense, some confused, and others looked almost guilty, as if they had already realized that things were not as they believed. But he wasn't speaking to make anyone uncomfortable. He was speaking because he had reached the point where staying silent was no longer an option. He took one breath, steady and slow, before continuing. He explained what happened on the day of the incident, how he was walking home, how he saw a group of kids arguing loudly, how the argument heated up into something dangerous. He explained that he had actually stepped in to stop the situation from getting worse, not to add to it. He described how one person had pushed another, and how he grabbed one of them to prevent someone from getting seriously hurt. But when people from the neighborhood arrived, they saw only the part where he was holding someone tightly, and they assumed the worst. As he spoke, the first witness shifted uncomfortably. The young man's explanation was not dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply clear. The details he gave fit together in a way that made more sense than the witness's earlier statements. He talked about how some of the neighbors had already believed that he caused trouble in the area because of rumors that spread months before. He explained how he had tried to keep to himself, not wanting to add fuel to those misconceptions. But he knew that once people got used to a certain story, they stopped questioning whether it was true. The judge leaned slightly forward. It wasn't a dramatic movement, but it showed something important. He was no longer treating this case like an easy verdict. He was paying attention, real attention. The prosecutor tried to maintain a serious expression, but he looked slightly irritated. He wasn't used to defendants speaking this way, with such clarity and calmness that it became hard to ignore them. He glanced at the judge, hoping he would interrupt, but the judge remained silent. The young man continued. He explained that the person he tried to protect had never stepped forward to tell the truth, because that person was afraid of being blamed by the community. He didn't blame them, he understood that fear. But he also said that it hurt to be treated like the problem simply because no one wanted to listen to the full story. He then mentioned something that made the room fall even quieter. One of the witnesses, the third one, had actually seen what really happened. Not the full situation, but enough to know that he wasn't the one starting trouble. The third witness had seen him grab the person to protect them from falling after being pushed by another kid. But the witness had hesitated to say it earlier because he didn't want to go against everyone else's version of the story. The older witness's eyes widened slightly. He didn't expect the young man to call him out, not in an aggressive way, but in a way that revealed the truth gently. He looked down at his lap for a moment, visibly shaken by his own silence. When the young man paused again, the judge turned to the older witness. "Is that true?" he asked. Everyone held their breath. The older witness opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. After a few seconds, he nodded slowly. "Saw him hold the boy after he tripped," he admitted, his voice soft. I didn't see him start anything. A ripple ran through the courtroom. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful enough to shift the energy in the room. People sat back, realizing that things were not nearly as simple as they once thought. Some exchanged confused looks. Others frowned, wondering how they had misjudged the situation so easily. The prosecutor tightened his jaw. His perfect narrative was falling apart. He quickly interrupted, trying to regain control. He pointed out that even if the young man didn't start the trouble, he still got involved. But the judge didn't respond right away, which made the prosecutor even more uneasy. The young man continued speaking, but now his voice carried a different weight. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was explaining what happened because he needed the truth to be seen, not for pity, not for praise, but simply because keeping quiet had allowed misunderstandings to grow. He explained that he didn't step forward earlier because, in the neighborhood, everyone already believed a version of him that wasn't real. He felt like anything he said would be ignored, twisted, or used against him. So he kept quiet, hoping that eventually the truth would come out on its own. But it never did, and the situation only got worse. A few people in the back row lowered their eyes, realizing how unfair that was. They had never given him the chance to explain. They had trusted hearsay instead of trying to understand him as a person. The young man's lawyer watched him closely. Even he seemed surprised by how powerful the testimony was. He knew his client was honest, but he didn't expect him to express everything in such a steady, sincere way. Then came the part of the testimony that completely changed the atmosphere. The young man explained that earlier that day, just an hour before the incident, he had received news that his father had been taken to the hospital. He was rushing home to get money for transportation when he heard the kids arguing. He didn't want to get involved. In fact, he desperately wanted to keep walking. But when he saw how the argument was escalating, he couldn't ignore it. He stepped in because he feared something serious would happen if he did the end. This revelation struck the room deeply. People who once looked at him with judgment now looked at him with a mix of shock and guilt. They had no idea he was dealing with something so heavy at the time. And yet, instead of focusing on his own problem, he tried to help others. The judge's expression softened just slightly, not in pity, but in understanding. He could see now that the case was far from simple. Far from the quick decision he expected. The prosecutor tried to object again, but this time the judge stopped him with a raised hand. Let him finish, the judge said firmly. The entire room felt the shift. The judge was no longer rushing through the case. He wanted every detail, every truth, every angle. The young man's voice steadied further as he described how the situation spiraled when adults arrived. They saw only a moment taken out of context. And because of old rumors about him, they filled in the rest with what they believed was true. He wasn't angry while explaining. He wasn't trying to guilt anyone. He was simply unveiling the truth, layer by layer, allowing the courtroom to see the full picture for the first time. By the time he finished, you could have heard a pin drop. Even the people who walked into the courtroom sure of his guilt now realized that they had misjudged him. The judge stared at him for a long moment, not saying anything. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. It was the kind of silence that meant he was processing everything carefully, rethinking every assumption he had made. The prosecutor looked down, uncomfortable, knowing he now had to rethink his entire argument. The witnesses were restless. Some felt exposed, others felt ashamed, and the young man, who had started the day carrying heavy silence, now stood with the weight finally lifting, because the truth was finally out. But the story wasn't finished yet. What he revealed next would not just shift the case, it would turn the courtroom upside down. The moment he finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. It wasn't the usual silence people kept out of respect. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone suddenly realizes they might have been wrong. For the first time since the case began, no one whispered to the person beside them. No one judged him with their eyes, and no one looked bored. Every face now carried a line of confusion, surprise, or guilt. Even the judge, who had been strict and impatient since morning, leaned back in his chair like someone trying to make sense of a new truth. He kept staring at the young man standing in front of him, tired, humble, scared, but still standing with honesty. The judge took a deep breath and asked the clerk to repeat the young man's words from the record. As the clerk read everything out loud, that silence grew even deeper. The story sounded completely different when heard all together. It wasn't the voice of a troublemaker or someone who wanted attention. It was the voice of someone who had been carrying a burden for a long time. People who were sure he was guilty began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked down, embarrassed by the way they had judged him before. Even the lawyer who stood against him couldn't hide the disbelief on his face. He had walked into this courtroom ready to win easily. But now it was clear the situation wasn't simple at all. The judge asked the young man to sit down, while the court took a short break to review everything again. The young man quietly nodded and stepped back, moving towards the chair where he had sat all morning. His legs felt heavy, but his heart felt strangely light. For the first time in days, he felt like someone had finally listened. As the court paused, people in the audience started whispering now, with judgment, but with confusion. Some wondered why nobody knew the full story before. Others murmured that maybe he was innocent after all, and a few were surprised that he had kept quiet for so long, even though he had such important truth to share. On the other side of the room, the main witness who had spoken earlier sat frozen. That person's face had turned pale, and they kept looking down at their hands. It was clear that the young man's testimony had touched something deep, something they hadn't admitted before. After a few minutes, the bailiff signaled everyone to sit down again. The judge returned to his seat with a calmer, more serious expression. He didn't look rushed anymore. Instead, he looked like someone who wanted to make sure the right thing was done. The judge called the main witness back to the stand. The witness walked slowly, each step heavier than the last. When they sat down, they kept their eyes on the floor, avoiding the young man's gaze. The judge asked a simple question: "Do you want to change anything in your previous statement?" The entire courtroom leaned forward. The witness took a long breath. Their voice shook a little as they began speaking. They admitted that they had left out important details earlier. They didn't lie exactly, but they didn't tell the full truth either. They confessed that the young man had tried to stop the situation, not create it. They also admitted that they had rushed to blame him because it was easier, and because everyone else seemed to think he was responsible. A few people in the back gasped. Others stared wide. The young man himself couldn't believe what he was hearing. For days, he had been fighting alone. And now the truth he had carried on his shoulders was finally being spoken by someone else. The judge listened silently, his hands folded in front of him. When the witness finished, the judge asked a few more questions, digging deeper into the events of that day. Piece by piece, the truth was laid out, and it became clear that the young man had been misunderstood from the beginning. When the witness stepped down, the judge called the opposing lawyer. The lawyer had no choice but to admit that the situation wasn't as simple as he had first believed. He tried to argue gently, but even he knew the case had changed direction. After this, the judge turned to the young man again. He asked him if he had anything more to share. The young man stood up slowly. He said he didn't want to blame anyone or hurt anyone. He just wanted the truth to be known because he had no one else to speak for him. He said he didn't expect sympathy or applause. He only wanted fairness. His words weren't loud, but they were strong in the simplest way. The judge nodded thoughtfully and told him to sit. The courtroom became quiet, once more, not tense this time, but peaceful. People watched him with a new respect. Those who had doubted him earlier now seemed ashamed. A few even smiled at him gently, as if giving him silent support. The judge then announced a final short break before the decision. Everyone stepped outside into the hallway. The young man walked out slowly, his hands in his pockets, unsure of what would come next. The air felt lighter than when he had arrived in the morning, yet he stayed tense. He didn't want to hope too much. As he stood near a window, staring outside, an older woman approached him. She had been sitting in the courtroom the whole time. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "You spoke with courage today." He didn't know her, but her words felt comforting. She told him that truth has a way of reaching people, even when it's late. Others also walked by and gave him small nods of encouragement. He wasn't used to strangers being kind to him, especially not during such a difficult moment. But each gesture felt like a tiny ray of light in the heavy darkness he had been living in. When court resumed, everyone returned to their seats quietly. The young man took a deep breath and looked at the judge. The judge began speaking slowly, choosing each word carefully. He talked about how the court had initially believed the case was simple, but after hearing the full testimony, it was clear that the situation had many layers. He acknowledged the young man's bravery in speaking up despite the weight on his shoulders. He then explained that the earlier statements had been incomplete, and the court now had a clearer understanding of what truly happened. The judge said that justice isn't about speed or assumptions. It's about truth, patience, and fairness. As the judge's voice continued, the young man felt his heart pounding. His palms grew sweaty, and he stared at the ground, afraid to look up. Then finally, the judge delivered the decision. The young man was cleared of the accusations. He wasn't guilty the moment those words left the judge's mouth. The courtroom exhaled as if everyone had been holding their breath. Some people even clapped softly before the judge signaled them to stop. Not out of disrespect, but out of relief. The young man sat silently for a moment, unable to move. It felt unreal. After days of fear, doubt, and sleepless nights, the truth had finally won. Someone beside him whispered congratulations, but he still couldn't speak. His eyes felt warm, and he blinked rapidly to control his emotions. When the judge finished speaking, he added something unexpected. He told the young man that the court had learned an important lesson that they never underestimate someone's voice, even if they seem quiet or alone. Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest truths. As the young man walked out of the courtroom, the people who had doubted him earlier now looked at him with admiration. A few stepped aside to give him space, and some even nodded respectfully. Even the opposing lawyer approached him and gave a small, sincere nod. Outside, the air felt different. He looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and let out a long sigh. The weight he had carried for so long finally felt lifted. He didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't shout. He simply smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. Deep inside, he knew this moment would stay with him forever, because he won a case, but because he learned how powerful truth can be when spoken with courage. And as he walked away from the courthouse, he carried something new within him: strength, confidence, and the quiet pride of someone who fought for what was right, and finally won.